Welcome back to Spinstress in the Making, Sewcialites Sew Along for block number 31, the Noble block. I'll be making the 9-inch block for you today, and for that one, for the background, I will need 4 4-inch squares, also 1 3.5-inch square, and then for my print, I will need another 4 4-inch squares and another 3.5-inch square here. And we're going to start off with our 4-inch squares, and as you can see with my background fabric, I have already drawn a line across diagonally on this. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take our prints, lay them nice and flat like this, and then make sure that your good side is facing in towards your other good side of your print, and lay these right on top. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sew on both sides of the 4th-inch seam allowance of this line. So you'll have this line, and then you'll sew a 4th inch over here, and then a 4th inch over here, and then we'll cut directly on that line to get our half triangle squares. So I will do these, cut them, and press, and come back to you when I've sewn all those. So I have sewn all of my half triangle squares together, as you can see, and I have pressed towards my darker print fabric, and now that I've created them, I need to trim them down. And so for our 9-inch square, these are going to have to be trimmed down to about 3.5-inch squares total. And the way I do that is I place my square with my seam diagonal facing this way, because when I get my ruler, I have an Omni grip ruler, and I'm going to use this line to make sure that it is centered in my block as I start trimming down. So we're going to go down to 3.5 inches. So I like to make sure, if I can, to have a little bit of excess on all sides of my square, and it's going to measure 3.5 inches. This line is going up against my seam, and now I can take my cutter and then trim down like this, pull it away, and now I have a nice square edge to line up my 3.5-inch ruler piece to right here. And as you can see, it's measuring up nice on my edge, and then also it has that diagonal still. And then I'm going to take my blade cutter, my rotary cutter, and trim one more time. So there's one block, and I will trim the rest of these and come back to you when I have done that. So I have finished trimming these down into squares, and just remember, when you're originally sewing that first line, before we cut them, and you're sewing those 2 4th-inch seam allowance lines, you really want to make sure that those squares are lined up as best as possible and your line is as straight as possible, because if you're off too much, then you actually may not have enough to trim down to make that 3.5-inch square. You might be missing a little bit on the corner somewhere, so it's not going to be a perfect square. So you want to try and make those sewing pieces as aligned as well as you can before you make those cuts, and then trim down so that it's easier when you're trimming down and you have the ability to move it around and score it as you need to. Luckily, most of mine came out good, so they're pretty nicely squared at this point, with my edges being actually in those points of those ends of those squares. So now that I have finished trimming all those pieces down, we can actually start laying this block out. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with these 3.5-inch pieces. So you've got one in your print and one in your background fabric, and they're going to be these diagonal corners from each other. And then now we're going to start laying this down. And I kind of have this pattern, directional pattern on my print, so I'm hoping I can kind of align them up so that that pattern is all facing the same way. So far I have enough right now, but let's see as we continue to lay this block out. So now I have my next line of blocks. So far, so good. And then I think my last few blocks aren't going to line up as well as I'd like them to, but it's not the end of the world. As long as the stripes are going the same way and they're not going weird and diagonal from each other, then I consider that a win. Hopefully nobody's going to be looking too closely on that. But here is the last block. And now I can put my little corner piece. Let me make sure that you guys can see all of this. Okay, perfect. So yeah. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of do this number, and then I have a lot that are facing up, and then we've got some that are facing down. So at least the things that are in the line together are all facing the same way, or at least look like they're facing the same way. I think that looks pleasing to my eye, so that should be okay. So now that I've laid it out, I can now sew these 3 strips together first with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Pressing, I'll probably press outwards on this top part and on this bottom part, and then press inwards in this middle part, and then we'll be able to sew those 3 strips together. So once I have done that and sewn these 3 strips together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'll come back to you, and then we'll sandwich it and finish off this block. So I finished sewing my strips together, and for the top one I have it pressed outwards, and the inside I have it pressed inwards, and then the bottom one is also pressed outwards. So now that we've completed those, what we can do is I can fold this down, sandwich those 2 points together, pin them, so with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, press it open, and then take this bottom half, fold upwards, so with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure those points are nice and sandwiched together, press downwards, press out, and we'll have this whole entire block completed, and I'll come back to you when I have done that. So here is the finished number 31 Noble block for the Sewcialites sew along. And for my directional, I kind of did a little play where these ones were pointing downwards, these blocks were pointing downwards, and then these 4 were pointing upwards. So it was a little more balanced and it wasn't completely mishmashed. But of course, if you don't have a directional fabric, then you can put it whatever way you want to. You don't have to worry about that. For the back side, I pressed actually with my seams facing down this way instead of inwards and outwards. But basically whatever lays your block the flattest when you press. And now that this block is finished, it's pretty nice, and I hope you found that this tutorial was helpful. And if you found it helpful, please like and subscribe so I can bring you more blocks and more videos. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and happy quilting.